The Way Ahead was not just Carol Reed's most criminally forgotten wartime film, it was a state-commissioned act of institutional self-examination that nearly tore apart the British Army's relationship with its own propaganda machine, and it was written by a private soldier being ordered to hide behind a pile of polished brass every time a real officer walked through the door. We are digging into the wreckage of The Way Ahead with 20 secrets the War Office tried to bury, secrets locked inside Army reports, military memoirs, and the kind of out-of-print autobiographies that survive only in the back rooms of second-hand bookshops. The War Office approved the title The Way Ahead for British audiences as something aspirational, a forward-looking rallying cry at a moment when the war's outcome remained genuinely in doubt. What the film's own publicity record reveals is that American distributors found that same title almost entirely useless. To stateside eyes in 1944, The Way Ahead carried no martial weight at all. It sounded like a motivational pamphlet. It offered no tanks, no beaches, no immediate signaling of combat. The American release was therefore renamed The Immortal Battalion, a title that announced itself immediately, that played to the same instinct that sells war films on every continent, the promise of glory. The British title was the braver, more honest one. The American title was the one that got reviewed in the New York Times. But the real problem was that even before the Americans had the chance to rename it, the film's institutional masters had already tried to kill its central argument at the source. By 1942, Carol Reed was a competent and promising British director whose work, Kips, The Stars Look Down, Night Train to Munich, had earned him professional respect without genuine auteur standing. He was good, he was not yet great. And the studio system of wartime Britain, operating under constant pressure from the Ministry of Information and the Army Cinematograph Service, was not a space that rewarded artistic ambition over institutional compliance. The Way Ahead was the production that pushed Reed from the first category into the second, the hinge between the accomplished journeyman and the director who would make Odd Man Out in 1947 and The Third Man in 1949. Everything that made those masterpieces possible. The psychological exactness, the discomfort with institutional authority, the refusal of false comfort, was first tested under live fire, in uniform, with the British Army looking over his shoulder. What he discovered was that the War Office and artistic integrity were not, in the end, compatible collaborators. The collaboration that produced The Way Ahead was, militarily speaking, a structural impossibility. David Niven was a lieutenant colonel. Peter Ustinov, 22 years old, no formal film training, but already possessed of a playwright's ear and a raconteur's instinct for human absurdity, was a private. The British Army did not permit officers and enlisted men to associate as equals. Niven's solution, documented in Ustinov's 1977 autobiography Dear Me, was to assign Ustinov as his personal Batman, his servant, so that the two could occupy the same room without triggering a court-martial. Ustinov would be in the middle of a scene or a piece of dialogue when the sound of boots in the corridor would alert them, and Niven would shout the warning, "Cave," Latin for beware, and Ustinov would immediately abandon his typewriter and begin frantically polishing whatever brass object was nearest to hand. A future two-time Academy Award winner, writing one of the most significant British films of the Second World War, hiding his screenplay under the pretense of domestic service. That is the actual condition under which The Way Ahead was composed. What most histories of The Way Ahead gloss over is that its direct predecessor, the 44-minute Army Cinematograph Service film The New Lot, made in 1943 by Reed, Ambler, and Ustinov, was suppressed. Not destroyed, suppressed. The Army screened it internally and then refused to allow its general release. The objection was not technical, the film was proficient. The objection was tonal. The New Lot depicted conscripts who resisted authority, complained about conditions, found military life genuinely unpleasant, and adapted slowly. Military authorities concluded that this portrait, however accurate, was not appropriate for civilian consumption. The film was therefore restricted to screenings for recruits only, people who, as one internal assessment noted with accidental comedy, could be expected to find such complaints no surprise. The Way Ahead was commissioned as its replacement, the same material, reworked for the people outside the barracks gates, softened just enough to pass institutional review. That softening is one of the film's deepest wounds, and it is visible in every scene where the recruit's discontent is resolved faster than real discontent resolves. Before David Niven was attached as both executive producer and lead actor, the role of Lieutenant Jim Perry existed without a star. The early discussions around casting, preserved in production correspondence, circled around the idea of a more explicitly working class, or at least less patrician officer. someone whose authority derived from demonstrated competence rather than bearing and education. What that version of the film might have argued was considerably more radical than what was eventually released, a portrait of earned authority rather than inherited authority, which in the class architecture of the British Army in 1944 was a genuinely destabilizing proposition. Niven's arrival foreclosed that argument before it could be made. His Sandhurst education, his officer's posture, his instinctive ease with command, all of it channeled Lieutenant Perry into something the Army could admire without discomfort. Niven was the right man for the film the War Office wanted. He may not have been the right man for the film Ambler and Ustinov had originally written. What makes Niven's casting simultaneously a compromise and a revelation is that he was not performing military authority. He was exercising it. At the time of filming, Niven held genuine rank in the British Army, had undergone real commando training, and would subsequently serve in the Normandy campaign. The scenes on Salisbury Plain, where Lieutenant Perry drills his reluctant recruits, were not reconstructions for the camera. They were, in effect, Niven at work. The duality is strange and unresolvable. The actor playing the officer was the officer. The performance that critics called polished and restrained was polished and restrained because there was nothing to perform, only to inhabit. The men alongside him on that parade ground were, in some instances, also serving personnel. The authenticity, the film projects, is not cinematic craft. It is documentary accident. The Way Ahead was explicitly commissioned to do for the British Army what Noel Coward and David Lean's In Which We Serve had done for the Royal Navy in 1942. That ambition is not subtext, it is documented War Office policy, recorded in the Army Cinematograph Service's production mandate for the film. What this official lineage conceals is the deeper structural debt. The Way Ahead owes to the American military ensemble tradition running through John Ford, the panoramic multi-character formation film, the democratic transformation narrative, the ordinary men becoming something greater than their origins suggested. Reed absorbed this tradition and then did something In Which We Serve conspicuously did not. He removed the class hierarchy's comforting haze. Where Coward's film presented class distinction as natural and even beautiful, Reed's film presented it as an obstacle to be overcome. That is a radical departure disguised as institutional compliance, and the War Office, astonishingly, appears to have missed it. Eric Ambler's contribution to The Way Ahead has been obscured by Ustinov's subsequent celebrity, but it was Ambler who brought the structural discipline that gave the film its architecture. By 1944, Ambler was already the most important British thriller writer of the preceding decade, the author who had, in the words of the literary critic Julian Simons, transformed the espionage novel from a genre of right-wing comfort into something morally serious and politically uncomfortable. He brought that same sensibility to the screenplay, the instinct for institutional critique, the suspicion of authority, the attention to the way systems grind individuals into shapes they did not choose. Ambler would later describe the Army collaboration with Ustinov as genuinely difficult, the rank difference creating frictions that extended beyond the logistical absurdity of Ustinov's Batman arrangement into the writing itself. As Ustinov recalled to a journalist in later life, Ambler wrote much better than he spoke and took the military rather more seriously than Ustinov did. What that tension produced was a script simultaneously more disciplined and more discomfited than either man might have written alone. The New Lot's Suppression was not the only institutional intervention in the Reed-Ambler-Ustinov project. The frame-rated film journal, drawing on production documentation, records that the Army authorities balked at several scenes in early drafts of The Way Ahead that depicted recruits' complaints about military life with too much sympathy, not in tone, but in duration. The War Office's position was consistent. Such material was acceptable as a stage to be transcended, not as a condition to be examined. The line between dramatic acknowledgement and dangerous honesty was policed carefully. Where the New Lot had crossed it and been suppressed, The Way Ahead was required to stay on the approved side. The resulting film threads this needle with considerable skill, but the skill required to stay within an officially imposed boundary is not the same skill as the freedom to draw your own. The difference is visible in every scene of training camp discontent that resolves more tidily than life would permit. William Hartnell, listed in the film's credits as Billy Hartnell, the diminutive that would take years to shed, had, until Carol Reed saw him in a theater production of Brighton Rock and cast him as Sergeant Ned Fletcher, built his career entirely in comic roles. He was a light comedy actor who could do farce. He was not, in the vocabulary of 1943 British casting, a tough man. Reed looked past this entirely. The performance Hartnell delivered as Fletcher, authoritative, complex, with a hidden tenderness underneath the bark, was so precisely cast against his previous identity that it immediately obliterated it. From 1944 onward, Hartnell could not escape the sergeant. He played policemen, he played thugs. He played soldiers in picture after picture, trapped in a typecasting that his own exceptional work had constructed around him. His biography, written by his granddaughter Jessica Carney, documents that Hartnell described himself for years as playing, in his own phrase, bastards, and that he eventually accepted the role of the first Doctor Who in 1963, specifically because it offered an escape from the prison The Way Ahead had inadvertently built. The irony is total. The performance that imprisoned him was among the finest work of his career. Somewhere in the cast list of The Way Ahead, billed only as officer on ship and given no credit on screen, is a young actor who had recently been discharged from the British Army on medical grounds and whose wartime record would subsequently become one of the most contested biographical fabrications in British film history. That actor was Trevor Howard. His appearance in the film went entirely unnoticed in 1944. What it actually represented was the observation of a future major film star by a director of growing reputation, because David Lean, looking for a lead for Brief Encounter in 1945, was pointed toward Howard specifically on the strength of what he had noticed in The Way Ahead. Lean recommended Howard to Noel Coward. Brief Encounter launched Howard's career. The uncredited ship officer in Reed's propaganda film was, in the precise sense, the first domino, and the film that laid it down received no credit for it either. Guy Green's contribution to The Way Ahead is almost entirely absent from the film's historical reputation, and this is an injustice worth documenting. Green, who would later win the Academy Award for Best Cinematography for Great Expectations in 1947, was tasked in 1944 with solving a problem that receives no commentary in any review the film has ever received: how to integrate staged dramatic footage with authentic documentary material in a way that maintained visual continuity. The documentary footage of North Africa, real military equipment, real locations, real soldiers, none of it matched the controlled studio conditions in which the principal actors had been photographed. Green's solution was to calibrate the entire film's visual grammar toward the documentary material, designing his staged compositions to match the texture and immediacy of the real footage, rather than asking the real footage to match the studio. The result, a film that maintains the feel of actuality throughout, is a technical achievement that was never recognized because it was invisible. The best cinematographic work always is. William Alwyn's score for The Way Ahead has been dismissed, somewhat unfairly, as generic Marshall filler, standard issue, in the phrase of one contemporary reviewer. What this assessment misses is that Alwyn was already one of Britain's most significant classical composers, and that his decision to write in what appeared to be a conventional register was itself a compositional choice rather than a failure of imagination. The score's restraint mirrors the film's visual restraint. Both Alwyn and Green understood they were working in service of a film whose emotional meaning was embedded in faces and behavior rather than in technical display. The music that the critics found forgettable was forgettable by design. The fact that it has never been excerpted, recorded independently, or subjected to a single scholarly examination represents one of the more complete acts of institutional forgetting in British film music history. The final frame of The Way Ahead does not read the end. It reads, the beginning. This is not sentiment, it is argument. The film's official status as a propaganda vehicle required it to close on a note of forward momentum, men advancing into smoke, the battle continuing, the sacrifice meaningful. But in that substitution of title cards, Ambler and Ustinov embedded something the War Office read as patriotic resolve, and what was actually a moral statement about the cost of what had been asked of these men. They are not finished, they are beginning. Everything that has been taken from them, their civilian identities, their resistance, their individuality, has been expended in preparation for a fight that the camera will not show and the story will not resolve. The closing card that the censors approved as heroic was, if read carefully, an acknowledgement that the film had described only the preparation for suffering, not its conclusion. That is not propaganda. That is something considerably more honest than propaganda. Among the suppressed details of the new lot, the Army training film that preceded The Way Ahead is a cameo appearance by Robert Donat, one of the most celebrated British actors of the era, the Oscar winner for Goodbye, Mr. Chips, as a fictional film hero whose image appears on a cinema screen while the recruits are given a brief period of leave. The cameo is a structural joke. The recruits watch a heroic screen performance while being trained for the real thing, and the gap between cinematic heroism and actual military experience is the film's entire subject. Donat's appearance was suppressed along with the rest of the new lot and has received almost no historical attention. In 1944, when The Way Ahead was released, the version of that same joke that Ambler and Ustinov carried into the feature film was subtler, but it was still there. The Chelsea pensioners who bookend the film, veterans who measure the present against their own remembered heroism, perform exactly the function Donat had performed in the suppressed original. Hartnell. They are the weight of the cinematic past bearing down on the uncinematic present. The Way Ahead was released in London on June 6, 1944. That date was not accidental. The production had been planned to coincide with a major military operation. This much the War Office publicly acknowledged. What the War Office could not have calculated precisely was that the operation in question would be the Normandy landings, the largest and most consequential Allied military operation of the entire war. The film therefore opened on the same day the men it had been designed to represent were dying on French beaches. David Niven, who had been released from active service to make the film, subsequently served in the Normandy campaign himself. The actor who had spent months playing a soldier for the cameras was, within weeks of the film's release, doing the same work for real. The film's authenticity was validated by the date of its release in a way nobody had planned and nobody could control. When The Way Ahead crossed the Atlantic as Immortal Battalion, it crossed as a substantially different film. The American re-edit, cutting the film from 115 minutes to approximately 86, removing nearly a third of its running time, and replacing the carefully constructed Chelsea Pensioner framework that opens and closes the British version with a direct address to camera by war correspondent Quentin Reynolds, did not merely shorten the film, it removed its argument. The Chelsea Pensioners who open the British version are the key to everything. They establish that the film is about the gap between the mythology of military service and its reality, between the glamour of remembered war and the grinding mundaneness of actual training. Their removal left the American version without this structural intelligence, reducing it to a recruitment film with a journalist introduction. The American version was reviewed more generously by American critics. The British version was the better film by a margin that is not small. The contemporary critical reception of The Way Ahead in 1944 was generous but superficial. In Britain, reviewers praised it as a superior propaganda exercise, effective, authentic, well-performed. They applied to it the criteria of the morale-sustaining wartime picture. Did it inspire pride? Did it represent British character admirably? Did it make audiences feel that the war was winnable by the kind of men they recognized? By those criteria, the film succeeded comfortably and was praised accordingly. What the critics were not equipped to notice in June 1944 was that the film they were watching was simultaneously performing its propaganda function and subverting it. That the recruits' slow, grudging, resentful conversion into soldiers was not a celebration of the British military system, but a portrait of what that system costs. The emotional honesty they praised as authenticity was, if read more carefully, institutional critique embedded inside institutional complicity. Seen from the distance of 8 decades, and particularly in light of everything that subsequent military history has documented about the gap between what institutions tell their soldiers and what those soldiers actually experience, The Way Ahead reads as something its moment could not quite receive. A film about the price of conscription paid in human particularity. The recruits' resistance to transformation, their clinging to civilian identity, their resentment of the process, their slow and partial surrender to a system they did not choose, is not presented as weakness to be overcome. It is presented as the human reality of what is being asked. The War Office approved this film as a recruiting instrument. What Ambler, Ustinov, and Reed actually made was a document of what it costs to be recruited. The difference between those two things is the film's entire moral intelligence, and it took 60 years of subsequent military history to develop the vocabulary to describe it clearly. The film that survived production is constrained. It is also, in its constraints, more revealing than the unconstrained version might have been. Carol Reed spent his career navigating institutional resistance, the Army in 1944, the studios afterward, and The Way Ahead is the production where the institution extracted the most significant concessions without managing to extract the film's essential argument. Reed delivered a film that passed its War Office review and passed it honestly, because the honest thing he was saying, that these men paid for their transformation in something that could not be repaid, was not the thing the War Office heard. He finished the film. David Niven went to Normandy. Ustinov never rose above the rank of private. Hartnell spent 20 years in uniform. And Trevor Howard walked off a ship in an uncredited scene and into a career that would define British cinema for 3 decades. The film that was designed to build morale turned out to be more interested in telling the truth. But here is the question that The Way Ahead leaves embedded in its final frame, in that 2-word substitution that the censors approved without understanding. If the British War Office required script approval as a condition of production cooperation, and if that approval demonstrably shaped what a film about the experience of ordinary soldiers was permitted to say about what was being asked of them, then how many of the war films you believe tell the truth are, in the most precise sense of the word, War Office approved versions of the truth? And if the answer is most of them, what does that mean for the act of watching men on screen transform into something their government needed them to become? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see the way ahead, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.